Welcome to episode 5 of the Radical Narrative Podcast. I'm your host, Milan Tatusis, coming at you from rural Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory. I want to give another shout out to all our followers and those who are subscribing and listening to our podcast. Thank you so much for sharing our work. And also to our new listeners, welcome to the Radical Narrative family. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Katie Kamelamela, based out of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Join us as we talk about land-based projects, Hawaiian lands and history, organizing in the time of COVID-19, new tech language tools, and ultimately, we plan to deconstruct some of those tourist assumptions we have of Hawaii. So stay tuned and listen in. Thanks for sitting with me. We go way back. You're basically my sister. I call you my sister because we've been in a certain academic style together for a while, talking story, touching base with each other. But the audience doesn't know who you are. So who are you and where do you come from?
Hi, my name's Katie Kamelamela. I'm talking story with Mylan from Mountain View on Hawaii Island, before known as Kapue Uhi. I'm born and raised on Oahu, which is a different island where Honolulu is, in Eva Beach, Waimalu, and I went to school at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Got my undergrad in botany and Hawaiian studies and my master's and PhD in botany, mostly working with forest gathering practices, Native Hawaiian gathering practices, and doing a lot of work with Native Hawaiian communities, mainly through primarily volunteering before doing any research. Not with that intent, it just kind of happened like that. And I have 2 dogs that are really cute and a fish named Honey.
Cool.
I'm like trying to think about the first time I met you, Mylan, and you brought up the memory of Waikane.
Yeah.
I just threw you guys in the back of my truck and we're off.
Yeah, so we met technically through academia. We met through the University of Hawaii Indigenous Politics program and my Indigenous Governance program at UVic. We had an exchange. And the first time I met you, I think we had class or something, like some formal orientation and things like that. And then all of a sudden you pulled up in a truck and you're all like, jump in, let's go eat. And the sun was already down. And I remember jumping in the back of your little truck and we were just cruising on the highway, me in the back of a truck with a few other classmates, and you took us to Waikane, and we went to the Waiho'ole Poi factory after hours. It's pretty famous normally, but you got us like the back door pass, and we were sitting there and eating some good food with good people. That was my first relationship with Hawaii, and a lot of people can't say that, so I always appreciated you doing that for me when we first met.
Yeah, I think we had like a music night that night, and I was like, oh yeah, it'd be cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was good. I don't live on that island anymore, so it's just good memories. And being on Hawaii Island, it's a lot different. It's really country. Like I live 40 minutes out of what would be our city area, which isn't really considered a city.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Indigenous politics was, we went up to Canada, did the whole salmon thing. I'd never eaten salmon really before that, and didn't understand that relationship from that area. So that was cool to see. And I did a pit cook because my master's was about underground imu in Hawaii, or underground ovens.
Yeah. Looking
at contemporary or how people practice underground ovens today. And so I did one with Cheryl Bryce. Yeah, so that was good fun. Yeah, that was character building experiences, man.
Yeah, I was just doing my master's, so I was still like young to the whole academic game. But we've been through a lot. Like, you're actually a doctor now. You finished your PhD. I'm still going slow. I'm the snail of the department, I always say.
Yeah. Oh, bro, it's not a race with anybody else, man. Yeah, getting the PhD was an experience, especially that last year. It was really making the decision that, like, am I going to do this? And then just like continuing on with that decision.
Yeah. I got some questions to ask you about PhD life and academia. But first, what I really want to get into firstly is we have listeners who like you're making references to Waikane, you're making reference to Oahu, and now you're on Big Island and things like that. A lot of people don't, like on the mainland, and we do have international listeners now. Like a lot of people don't really understand how unique Hawaii is because they're basically just seeing it through media portrayals or through like the tourist industry. So, in your own words, like how do you describe your landscape to somebody who's never experienced it? Because there is like this image of your territory and your land base and water base that's really romanticized.
When I was younger, my mom went to New York. I think I was like 12. And she came back and she went to like, the Statue of Liberty, and she had to go for business, which wasn't a normal thing. And when she came back, I was like, what was it, Mom? And I've experienced this too. So when I come back home from anywhere, it's just like Technicolor coming back home. And that doesn't really make any sense anymore now that we have like high definition. But I guess it would be like high definition is what it is when you come to Hawaii. Like there's just so much clarity. You can go on the continental United States like for hours, seeing the same flat. But in Hawaii, because of the age of our islands, is very expansive in a small area. We have lowlands. We have the most diverse like environment kind of on the planet. From alpines, like we just got a snow dusting on the mountain yesterday, down to the beach. When people come to Hawaii, they expect like nice weather 24 hours a day and 365 days a year. And it's just not like that. It's very variable because we are in the middle of the Pacific, like 2,000 miles away from any landmass, like large landmass, 4 hours on a plane from any direction, from Asia or North America or South America. It's just, we're very isolated and interdependent on our resources. We just currently got shipping, and I say currently, right? In like the 70s and the 60s. In like the 60s, we were pretty sustainable still. And then the industry kicked in. And then in the 80s and 90s, now we're like 95% dependent on resources coming from the outside. So like this whole COVID thing, like is kind of a big deal. Because if anything happens, we just open up to tourism. And now our numbers are spiking again, like really bad. And so a lot of what is sold is like the sexualization and the pornographic nature and separation from environment. So people come here for vacation and like to get away. But what they don't show you is like, the traffic jams, the houseless people on the beaches or in downtown or in Waikiki. The reality, it may be a different place, but going to New York, there's still similar situations. Like there's still like a town vibe or a city vibe. It's really interesting. Like even within the Indigenous community, when we talk about cultural appropriation and even within our communities, because of the projection and the promotion of our cultures as sexualized natures, we also sometimes fetishize each other's cultures because that's just what we have available. And so I think that's what happens with Native Hawaiians, more so because of the advertisement that we have about, hula skirts and coconut bras and all of that. But in my work in doing underground ovens, I did go to a luau, which I'd never gone to like a tourist luau before. So I wrote it off as like research, which is like kind of wild, right? So I went to Jermaine's luau and I did the whole thing. And come to find out that this is part of the reality that a lot of people, not even people in Hawaii, know about, but a lot of those luau's are manned by generational families that keep their traditions alive by doing those kind of luau's, as well as holding their own family halaus or schools of knowledge separately. And so that didn't come out till like years after me going to that luau. But I think that that's really something we don't talk about in our communities, how even when I went to New Zealand in Rotorua, which is known as Roto Vegas, because there's a lot of culture on display for commodification, but it's also one of the places that has the highest retention of Te Reo Maori, or like their native language. It's also a place known for cultural traditions and being steadfast in those traditions. And it's because of the tourism. So like there's like this really, really large range of tourism, to Native peoples being on the front line of tourism, being like, you know, the baggage claim. Like some of my friends have been my uncle still is, you know, working at hotels, and that being an opportunity for people to put food on their table, as well as hold traditions. But then like the opportunity cost obviously is the exchange of land and the pushing out of what was to cater to outside. Like most of Waikiki is like, I'm pretty sure like Fendi and like Louis Vuitton and these like really high label retailers, which is like not what local people shop at. So it's very catered towards, like, you can go to Waikiki and probably have the same experience in California. You're just paying for the flight. Especially if you just stay in Waikiki. So I think you guys coming out and, you know, you just came, like, I just invited you guys to come cruise with us. And you kind of just saw a little bit part of like that's my reality, you know, like I just invited you to see, like, these are my friends and this is what we do. And we don't do this all the time, but it just so happens that you guys were here, and like it's a good exchange, right? Because those guys also go and visit other indigenous peoples, like up in Barrow in Alaska, or so it's this whole like indigenous network of people who are actively engaging, like seeking out or being asked or being sought out to be representatives for their community. Everyone has that opportunity and access, I would say, as long as, you know, just showing up is like the biggest thing.
Yeah, just showing up and also being welcomed, right? Like being invited, not only being invited, but also being welcomed, because there was like a welcoming aspect that is really practiced in your culture also.
Yeah, that is true. The vibe is really important.
Yeah.
The vibe, seeing people do the work in what do they call it? First impressions.
Mm-hmm.
First impressions are really, really critical and really interesting in these times. Now we're all meeting each other on Twitter and Zoom and these meetings that maybe wouldn't have been accessible. So yeah, it's really interesting with the opening up of tourism. Hawaii was on lockdown from tourism up until like, I think just like a month ago. So what you had was like 6 months of nobody on the beaches, nobody on trails, or a highly reduced amount of people in the environment. And so what we saw was traditional seaweeds coming back, different fish coming around because Hanauma Bay was closed, higher breeding rates of fish. These are all things that were being reported like in the news and in like our community networks and stuff like that, you know, actively observe our environment for resources. So now we're back to the status quo, not fully, but we're, you know, people are back on beaches, Jeeps and Mustangs are back on the road, more resources, more people at the stores. We've seen with COVID time for our resources to rest. So now people are thinking like maybe we should do that more often.
Wow. Yeah, you just like hit the nail on the head, because one of the reasons I wanted to pod with you was because in my community, not to discount people who want to travel and see the world, but the experience some people have when they go to Hawaii isn't the experience I had. And there's a lot of social, political, and even economic issues. And you're just highlighting that in the first like 15 minutes of this conversation. I guarantee you a lot of people are hearing this for the first time, but then at the same time, a lot of people completely had that romantic notion of Hawaii. And just to hear you unpack this and lay it out in this way is amazing, because that's exactly what I wanted you to talk about is even just how this land is being rejuvenated.
Yeah, I think locals have been good at staying home. There's also been a movement towards, I know there's like a group online that's cataloging all of the fish catches. Like, so fishermen are voluntarily signing on to this Facebook group. I think it's public, or I don't know if it's public or private. I haven't been in for a while. Anyways, he asks, how much have you caught? You know, you can put a picture of your fish up. And then he also asks, how much people are you feeding and where did you get it from?
Mm-hmm.
So every month he compiles it. And so I think that's really great practice, you know, like it's buy-in from the community, it's access, like it's accountability. It shows the importance of our resources during, like, it may not be seen as a drought, but when you have restrictions on travel or barges, you know, it was intense in March for, like, we hunkered down. A lot of people have been impacted economically, severely. And so this come back to Hawaii being so isolated, our inter-island freight has been cut by more than 50%. So my island, instead of getting 2 shipments a week, only gets 1 in my port. And so that means that we get half the amount of resources. Wow. But that also means that there's also been a drop-off in requests from businesses because there isn't tourism or as much tourism. A big bunch of the food production or food transport was a big part of that for all the hotels. So there's been a refunneling of that restaurants, the bulk buying initially was being portioned out for consumer consumption instead of bulk consumption, because there was so much resource left over from, or that needed to be refunneled from tourism use or non-use.
So how have you been dealing with COVID on the personal and professional level?
I'm pretty isolated. Personally, I work from home. I've been working from home since March, doing my postdoc. So I've been just organizing online mostly. And it's been really a trip to how can you be supportive when you're virtual? You know, like how can you lend support to your people in like their dire time of need? People who don't have internet access, like what do you do about that? So the mutual aid within our community is really important. So there've been, we have a site called Kukulu Switchboard, Kukulu Switchboard. And so someone set it up so people can ask for resources as well as provide resources, and people that need them can reach out either way.
That's cool.
So they've provided computer funding, job training, website services, like all kinds of stuff. So that was like a mutual aid that we could do digitally. And that was made by some local tech entrepreneurs. So that was really cool as like a community service.
So yeah, it sounds like there's been some technical mobilizing in the wake of COVID, and some cool things have come from that.
Yeah. So because of COVID, now we have like regular Hawaiian programming that's live streaming like weekly. Different highlights of parts of our community. It's called Kanaeokana, Kanaeokana. And they're on Facebook. So they have a repository of all of their presentations, and they're all like Hawaiian based, like program based. Wow. So that's been really cool. So really being able to fill in the gaps as a community, or at least provide opportunities for education materials, has been really cool to see.
Yeah, that's all sounds amazing. And I knew that there's going to be some tricks up the Kamelamela sleeve when COVID was going to show up, because your ability as a people to come together and do land-based projects and community projects is really cool to see and really informed my process, really informed the work I do in my own territory. But it's also interesting to see how, like, in the Western world, there's always like this cheesy cliche of like the end times or end of the world, we're all going to die. But you're talking to how Kanaka Maoli came together and are filling in the gaps with really cool programming and really cool insights and awarenesses.
Yeah. So I'm gonna my auntie Kale, I don't know if you met her or if you've met her. If you've like did some Hawaiian moon calendar stuff or had a speaker, that was probably her. But she started going online in March. She just wanted to do it for herself to like calm her own nerves about all of the COVID alarms going off. Mm-hmm. So she started doing traditional Hawaiian prayers or pule chants on Facebook Live.
Wow.
And so someone helped her out and they did a Zoom. And so I've been helping her out. So ever since like March, we've been meeting at 9:00 every morning and doing Hawaiian prayers. And she's taught, like, we just released our 16th one today. So I built an app for it and we have meetings every day. We do 5 and people choose. And it's just been like wild. Like today we had 97 people on live with us. Between like Facebook, Zoom, and Instagram. So there's like a need for community to meet virtually in like a Hawaiian space. So a Hawaiian perspective, like for support. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just kind of there cruising just to support her with tech. It's just been really amazing because her jam is to make traditional prayers and stuff relevant. So we've done a couple events around the solstice, and then we're doing one at the end of the month about makahiki, and it's open to the community and online. So the participation has been like kind of wild. It's been like there's a need is basically what we're seeing, and so we're trying to figure out how we can provide more support for our community, making it available when they need it. So the app kind of helps them out there. There's like the chant in Hawaiian and English with audio. And then we have some other features in there, but it's really simple. But I think that that's a really good model that maybe people in your community who's doing language revitalization would be interested in learning how to build for your community. Yeah. Or somebody living somewhere else who has an indigenous language who wants to share their stories, you know? That's what I think is the most powerful part, is that it's not just for Hawaiians or for Hawaii. It can be adapted to help people reconnect with their culture, even in the diaspora. For
sure. So utilizing that technology to fulfill the goal of language revitalization.
So, because I'm helping with the tech, you know, it's like a producer part, basically. So I've worked with Auntie Kale for like a while, over 10 years. And so I've been, you know, she's been my teacher and has taught me these things. So when I'm going through them, I'm looking at it from like a producer's point of view. And so what I see is, and what we hear as feedback is, even especially from people from the diaspora, is like this connection with culture and this access, because normally chants and things like that are really, you know, you don't do that, you don't share that.
Yeah.
But her goal is to revitalize these practices as a community. So I guess to support in that capacity has been really interesting during this time of COVID. And it's been a really enlightening opportunity to provide that kind of support. So I created that app to help me, because I've been learning chants or pule for at least 10 years, longer than that. And it's really hard to learn. If you're learning any language things and you're not a first language speaker, it's, you know, it's always a learning process. So my dream was always to have an app that had the pule, the voice, and the translation so I could look it over. So I think it's just something that is a need that I had that, you know, other people maybe didn't know that they needed that to help them out.
Yeah, that's really unique and cool to hear. And diaspora, a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of Indigenous Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli, on the mainland, and they're all over, and even in some urban centers too.
Yeah, so I think we have like 400,000 Hawaiians in Hawaii. I think that's what it is, but we have 500,000 Hawaiians outside of Hawaii. So I think it's like that right now because even my dad moved to Arizona in 2017 to retire. It's just like exorbitant to live here. It's like super expensive. Yeah, it's super expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't even get into that. Shipping, isolation. If you live in a isolated community, you know what I'm talking about. A lot of our people, I haven't looked at the back end on that, but we do have a lot of people from California. We do have people from New York and Arizona and all around the states. Mm-hmm. But I'm actually participating in the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, which is kind of, it was established by Prince Kuhio in the 1900s. I think he just had like a 100-year anniversary. But anyway, so there are Native Hawaiians who have clubs all across the United States and in Hawaii, and we meet. And so people bring together resolutions. I was thinking about it, like, I don't know if it's the same thing as, like, we don't have tribes here. Like, it's not, like, we don't have that political structure. Like, I look at that as, like, a political structure. Yeah. Like, we don't have that here as Hawaiians because of the only thing that comes to mind is cultural obliteration, but I don't know how to make that sound nicer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that then. Yeah, the political structure that we had built was dismantled. And so we're just trying to still figure that out as a people. There is a structure that was put together by Prince Kuhio, and so people from Native Hawaiians from all across the United States participate in that, and it's a way for people, not just Native Hawaiians, like non-Hawaiians can join those groups as well, but in order to start a club, you need to have Native Hawaiians as the core membership.
That's unique. That's really cool. I know you said that, like, yeah, there was aspects of colonization that were really harsh, obviously, like everywhere you go where there's Indigenous people. But you highlighted something unique in just how you were talking there and how, you know, Prince Kuhio created this structure, like this outreach kind of program. There's a lot of history your people have. And like even just this whole aspect of that I really recognize your people really achieving was being really flexible with the times and doing so that's really culturally relevant. And even like this utilization of the app, what comes to mind is I think me and you may have had conversations about Samuel Kamakau and the work he was doing really early on with Hawaiian newspapers.
Right. Yeah, and I think so Kamakau recorded kind of like everything. If you look at Samuel Kamakau, if you just Google him, you'll see the books that he's written. And so that's really where a lot of what Auntie Kale has done comes from, is just bringing voice to Kamakau.
And Kamakau actually literally taking pen to paper and writing a lot of information down, and that existing in archives now today.
Yeah. So Native Hawaiians are unique in identifying like one of the largest repositories of Hawaiian writings. And it was because when the missionaries came, they created Hawaiian language because it was an oratory language. And they created a written language. Mm-hmm. And so that written language was able to be pressed onto paper. And so to save the stories of that time, Kamakau and many other writers took to the written word and, you know, published voraciously. And it is because of those newspapers and the research that not just that people have done to revitalize the newspapers and their importance. We have a lot of resources to pull on and see on how life was and what people were doing, and they codify or they recorded practices, and so people are able to revisit and reawaken those words. So it's kind of wild.
Yeah, it was totally wild. I think we may have did a little reading on them in one of our grad programs when we were there, like our exchanges. But yeah, that like Kamakau's really stuck out as somebody that, you know, influenced my work too, and just in terms of how I write things and would I choose to write? Because it really did echo to today. And I think he was writing like in the early 1800s or mid 1800s.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the first like half of this podcast, you gave a lot of people a lot to unpack because you're talking a lot about very culturally relevant stuff, but it's really unique because, again, a lot of people only know what they see on Disney Moana, and they don't realize that there's a very diverse, unique culture that is navigating a lot of the issues we're navigating, and they're doing so on the fly. Like they're actually navigating, you're navigating a lot of very real contemporary issues. But one thing that's unique about you that I really want to highlight is you also introduced me to this concept of front of the house and back of the house activism.
Oh, yeah, man. I'm still back of the house, man.
Yeah. So do you want to unpack that? Because we live in a time where activism is needed, where it is also very popular. A lot of young people will find their way to the front line for various reasons and be in that space. However, there's a lot of logistical support that goes into creating those movements and those actions.
Yeah. So, man, I haven't even thought about that for a long time. So obviously, if you're listening to front of the house and back of the house, obviously I've worked in a restaurant. So the front of the house is everybody that you see, everybody that's serving, everybody that greets you. It's like the people that you get to know. And the back of the house is everybody that makes it happen so that you can have that whole entire experience and not know that anything happened that may have gone awry. I consider myself a back of the house, definitely just through actions. And I'm not the one that, I always defer the mic. I try not to be online. My face is usually never associated with something. That's just like, for me, that's just like my jam, because there's a lot of logistics that goes on to creating events, to creating awareness, to creating education that is accessible to people. And the things that, like, I'm going to go with education campaigns that I've run before time, like the last 10 years, has been really on like the periphery of the normal day-to-day conversation. So like, how do you get through to people to a conversation that they've never heard before and have them engaged in it? It's really, that's what back of the house is. It's all of those logistics. It's about making sure everyone is comfortable in how things are set up and the timing, and not just the people who are presenting, but the people who are coming and sharing their time and their space. And to just make sure that the people who are the front of the house and who are going to be on the camera and are going to be posting are comfortable with the message, and make sure that their voice is really what's being delivered, and that, you're not changing the intent of the message, but to make sure that we can get across in a more concise way. So yeah, man, that's kind of what it is. I guess you wouldn't really consider this back of the house because I'm on a podcast, but I'm kind of just talking story with Mylan. So I'm excited to, hear back about, feedback and see how people see like how they feel comfortable in their activism. And one isn't better than the other. They're both needed. And when you have a really good partnership, they're both valued and they both understand that, like, I can't do what I do in the back of the house if you don't do what you do in front of the house, and vice versa.
Yeah. So
it's like a really good partnership. And some people do that wholly by themselves. And that is just amazing.
Yeah.
It's not just event-based, but building networks and supporting other people building networks is also part of that work, providing and supporting conversations and different kinds of writing, a lot of writing.
Yeah, we were doing an action in Saskatoon last spring, and we were sort of helping facilitate some of the things that needed to happen. And in a moment, I just drew on our little whiteboard planning board there, back of the house, in front of the house, and asked who's comfortable in those spaces, and sort of unpacked what those spaces are in context to an action. And it worked really well. Everyone found a place and everyone found what they were comfortable doing, and everyone recognized that in each other. So we were kind of conscious of what somebody else was bringing to the table and what their limits were and where their strengths were. So it was a really cool model that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, and that's really important, and that's actually one of the first things when I start working with people. I'm like, what do you want to do? Like, what makes you happy? Like, if we're on a project, what would be the thing that would make you, what do you think is your wheelhouse, number one? And then what in that wheelhouse do you actually want to do? And then I'm like, okay, cool. That sounds good. Like, this is what I want to do, and this is what I don't want to do. And they're like, oh, okay, I can do that part. So it makes also the work more enjoyable, no matter what it is, and it also makes those boundaries clear, so you don't have to duplicate work.
Yeah. There's no finger pointing, it seems. It removes that because you know where somebody's space is and what they're committed to and not committed to.
And like, if it falls by the wayside, like it's cool. Just let me know.
Yeah.
And then we can assess if like that's something we really want, then like we'll figure it out. And if not, then, next time.
Yeah. Yeah. So you do have experience with activism and things like that. But just in general, there's political issues in Hawaii, obviously. And a lot of that is tied to even history. And sometimes some people don't realize that Hawaii has a unique history in terms of not initially wanting to be a part of the U.S. and that there was an actual Hawaiian monarchy actively engaged in creating their own systems and their own autonomy. What is some of that history for somebody who's never heard it?
Yeah, so Kamehameha brought together the Hawaiian Islands. Cook came in 1778, and then during that time, well, he died in 1779. Sorry, I laughed.
So he was ultimately taken out, obviously, for being colonial. But yeah, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, so Cook was the voyage that brought a lot of disease. So it started some of that disease collapse within our community. And it also was a time when, outsiders brought iron and guns. Things started to change along with the systems going along.
Yeah, so Kamehameha basically unifying the islands and laying the groundwork for a unique system.
Yeah, so I think, and people out there can Google me because, again, dates aren't my jam, but I think Kamehameha organized the islands in 1810, and then he passed away in 1819. And by that time, he had united the islands, which had never been done. Hawaii was given over after the passing of, I believe, Kamuali'i. So they passively came into the Union. And then that started the transition over into, it created into a monarchy. So there are 5 different Kamehamehas. There's a short occupation by the British. By that time, Hawaii had already created treaties internationally as the kingdom. And then there's the overthrow in 1893. And then it went to the Republic. And then said annexation was passed through the United States Congress through the Newlands Resolution. And so that was used to claim annexation of the land. I feel like I'm like lecturing right now. So sorry about that.
No worries. I mean, the goal of having a conversation about this history is also for people to see that Hawaii is not a tourist destination, that there is a consciousness there. There is a history of struggle and resistance and wanting to position that.
Yeah. A lot of our community is now made up of, we're very multi-ethnic, Hawaiian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Puerto Rican, Mexican. Many of those, all of those, except for Native Hawaiians, obviously were imported for sugarcane and pineapple fields. Pineapple isn't native to Hawaii. It was brought in as an agricultural crop.
And a lot of those crops brought in actually just changed the whole land structure and how things were functioning there.
Yeah, so land in Hawaii was publicly in trust, and then the Mahele happened, which privatized land and allowed for large sugar plantations and pineapple plantations to open up and get large pieces of land, which is still an issue today, even though sugarcane died like a while ago now. So now those lands, which were, man, the whole pesticide thing is a whole nother jam. But now we're dealing with water rights issues coming from that.
Yeah, and that's sort of just translating into like I guess it's the historical wrongdoing of Hawaii becoming a state and basically being annexed by the US, which wasn't necessarily the goal for y'all.
Skipped over a whole bunch there with Hawaii becoming a state. And yeah, that vote, a lot of people didn't participate in that vote, and how that vote was questioned is of question still.
And ultimately that playing into the tourist industry. So laying the groundwork for the tourist industry also.
Yeah, tourism was originally brought in, and I really should find this reference because I did see it in the Hawaii State Archives, and someone's probably going to go in there and burn it now. But it's on the Republic record, I think, or at least on the legislature notes, that tourism was created to drown out the vote of Native Hawaiians. And they wanted to do it quickly so that people would be able to buy land and supersede the vote. So voting is very political inherently, but how voting is created also is very strategic. So when you look at tourism, and when I look at tourism, and if I look at it from the lens of that perspective of that governing body, which was part of the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, and their goal and objective was to drown out the vote, they're doing an amazing job. They are very much exceeding probably the expectations they set for themselves, and are generationally successive in that endeavor subconsciously, without people really knowing it. And I think that that has allowed me to look at tourism in a different light, and policy, and the importance of policy, and the intentions of policy. And it's probably why I engage in those arenas on different levels. So yeah, I totally forgot about that. But that's one of the things a lot of people may not be aware of.
So yeah, tourism actually increasing the population and marginalizing Native Hawaiians politically by basically outnumbering them.
And I'm not saying that that's other people's reasons why they have tourism, but in my understanding, in my personal research, you know, I'll go look through my archives, but I know I took a picture of that. And what was I looking for? I was doing land research at that time. And I had to look through one of the logs, and it just so happened I also, when I do research, I flip.
Yeah, so being in the archive and then you have a log and you're flipping through the pages, looking back and forth. Yeah. So why is that important to do?
Because you're never going to go through those logs again. And I just like to see what people were writing about back then. So we also have that amazing privilege in Hawaii, and people may not view it as so, but I do. We have the Hawaii State Archives. And the thing that's really brilliant is, so we had this whole overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, the Republic. I know I'm missing something in between there. And then there's territory times, and then there's state times now in like a governing timeline. Through that whole time, none of the government documents, or all of the government documents, have been housed in the Hawaii State Archives. So you can still access notes written by Queen Liliuokalani or Kalakaua, who were our reigning monarchs during the kingdom era. There's historical things like banners and, you know, articles. This was like a really interesting, this is going to blow your mind, Mylan. I don't think we've talked about this, but I had met with the head of the state archives. I forget his name. And he had this idea, and this is going to be really wild. So those guys that overthrew the kingdom looked at themselves as Hawaiians. Mm-hmm. And he was like, stay with me on this. He was like, that's what he said to me. I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, if they didn't see themselves as Hawaiians, then they would have burned everything from the kingdom era. They did sell off the palace and a lot of the things that were in there, but they kept their ledger notes. Like they kept the minutes, like they kept the the policy record, like from the
Hmm.
kingdom. Like they didn't torch that. And like usually when you have like overthrows and like, well, that's not the right word, but like,
Hmm.
you know, like full on anarchy and like a flaming a culture, you would usually burn those notes as like a tactic, right? Like you want to burn the beliefs of people, their knowledge base, like their practices, and
Yeah.
that's what written things became, right? But we have the largest repository of Hawaiian language newspapers. We have all of our government documents going back to the kingdom era. Like this was just a realization early. I had a conversation with the guy like in January earlier this year. And so it's really been kind of like now I have to look through and like I'm like
Hmm.
it like rattles me, right, bruh? Like it's like core action. But to think of these people who overthrew the kingdom that think about themselves as Hawaiian subjects and actually demonstrating that through not torching these documents is like, okay, then
Hmm.
what's in these documents? Like, if they didn't torch it, they wanted us to find something. So, like, what are we supposed to be looking for?
Yeah, so to break that down, if you had like annexation and violent overthrow and just like you said, anarchy, there were people actively engaged in trying to preserve and maintain the political historical presence you have through those archives. Yeah, that's really unique. Are you looking at archives from that lens now? Like, are you doing that work right now to assess that?
I'm not doing that, but I do have a friend who is doing that, and he kind of goes through the archives. That's like his job now, and he's documenting everything, and they're making it available online, so people can look through those documents digitally pretty soon. It's like one of their projects. Um, Sorry, that was like a whole different tangent, but like, isn't that wild? Like, isn't that a wild idea?
It is. Well, firstly, like for me, it's always a wild idea to think about like how the Hawaiian monarchy was actively, doing their nationhood project to maintain who they are, but then to find out that you have these archives and these resources that you could navigate to sort of structure and look at how you're going to exist politically is also really unique. That I don't think my people in particular. Yeah, we have treaties, we have sort of notes here and there, but and we do have a writing system, but I mean nothing that is as archived as what you're dealing with over there. So it is mind blowing in that, people could collectively go look at their history and literally see notes written and literally see minutes from those eras and navigate that. That's unique. And not only that, but like a lot of relatively cultural, cosmological information's in there and a lot of international information where your people were actively engaged in diplomatic projects internationally, and we're talking over the span of like decades. It wasn't just like instant contact and colonization took place. No, there was an actual active political resistance taking place in Hawaii since contacts and the engagement with European powers. It's amazing to see.
Yeah, and the wild part is the idea that
Yeah.
just came to me is like, what if we had relations with your people? Like, what if there's notes about that? Like, because they were talking to like a lot of people, a lot of heads of nations, of different nations. And so in Polynesia, like, you know, Tahitians, Marquesans, Samoans, Fijians, Maori, that's like probably it's like the coolest thing about being Hawaiian, man, is that I get to engage with all of these like Polynesian
Yeah.
ancestors who are alive, who have like these different puzzle pieces of our culture.
Yeah. So also just you're speaking to Polynesia. So how there's a relationship with other Polynesians and there's cultural similarities there. Can you give an example of some of those similarities? Because the Pacific Ocean's vast, but you all were navigating that and living in that space and ultimately doing cultural exchanges because you're kinship. How are those cultural exchanges still happening today? Because that's also very unique.
Like, so we have things like, so the Maoris started their te reo thing, their kohanga reo, their language nest. And so we were able to adapt that to Hawaii, which is now spreading other places. And so we have other practices like makahiki practices, which are going back down to and being shared with Maori in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And I think that's like really the magic of like these cultural exchanges. Like this is what we're doing right now. It's like really, really cool that we get to learn. I get to learn from you. And I'm like, oh, like, what if we did that? Like, what if we have that? Like, where would that be if we had those resources? So I think that that's like really the magic of it all.
Yeah, the magic being that we have autonomy to travel, we have autonomy to have these nation to nation relationships and these cultural exchanges. And yeah, what would that lead up to? Like if we had that fully, what would that lead up to?
The possibility of reawakening things that have been sleeping for so long. And just resting.
Yeah, totally. Just like the fact too, like looking at Kamaka's work and things that he's written and how it translated into like the modern era where Hawaiians are actively picking up again things that he wrote about. That was just mind baffling. Like that was mind boggling to me to see on the fly.
Yeah.
There's also like this concept that you've highlighted multiple times, and one is you're using academia as a tool to do all this work. And you do have, multiple degrees, but how are you navigating that? Like, how are you navigating being a Hawaiian? Obviously, we talked about writing already, like how, writing's not necessarily foreign or it's enforced because, Kamaka was utilizing that in the early 1800s as a tool. But how are you doing your work and what's inspiring you to get that PhD and do the work that you're doing now?
It just kind of came. I can't say that because it does take work to do those things and get those letters and things like that. But I really just tried to, first of all, I was part of a community, and I'm just going to set it up like that. I was part of a community, and I just so happened to come back home and became part of this community and started doing work by myself. And people heard about the water quality work I was doing in my undergrad and had asked me to help their community. And it just worked out that when I moved on in my schooling, I had been working with that community for like 4 or 5 years at least, helping them with water quality and school things. And so I asked them if it was okay if if they're interested in working with me for my master's and like kind of highlighting that.
So your work always being practical and essential to like community needs. I've always recognized that in you. Like I've always seen that that's a unique characteristic with the work you're doing. And a lot of Native Hawaiians honestly have these really cool practical projects. Yeah, it's really cool to see that.
The thing about me is that I've really kind of just been able to be me the whole time.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. And I'm trying to think of like how that translates to today. Like currently my job as a postdoc at the Kaka Foundation for Tropical Forests, which is amazing on its own. Their mission is to bring Native Hawaiians back into the forest, which is my mission in life.
Yeah, so you completed your PhD, but then you kind of got pulled into a cool project where now you could do your postdoc. So there's always like this sense of like being practical and relevant because you're actually doing the work anyway. So how did that happen? How did you get to the point of where you're now doing a postdoc that's very relative to land?
My recommendation for my PhD, which was about forest gathering practices, I did the first analysis of forest gathering permits for the state. And then I also did market assessments and individual and online like structured surveys looking at that kind of stuff. So one of the things was a community-based subsistence forest area. And so I was actually asked to support a community-based subsistence forest area that they wanted to start by a community member. And I was like, okay, so if they're asking, then I'm going to go. And I'd never met this person before.
So you were actively recruited to like do this postdoc in this cool project. How did they find you? Like, how did they get in touch with you and locate you in general?
They had seen my work. I had presented again at like a conference, and I saw them there, and I was very nervous that they were there in the front row.
It's really cool how you were actively engaged by a community member. That's something I strive for, is finding people who are doing really cool work for Indigenous lands and Indigenous people and actively recruiting them to do projects in our community or in our area. What's one of the themes of your work? Like, what's the theme of this overall, if you were to sum it up?
So I guess the theme is a lot of my stuff starts from volunteering. And I know that everybody doesn't have that privilege, but there's different ways that I volunteer. And throughout the years, obviously before it was physical, but now it's a lot of digital work, helping people get their message out and stuff like that. But really using and being conscious about like, what do I want to do? A lot of people wanted me to be a professor, and I did that for, grad school, TA, and I was like, this isn't my jam, man. Like, I just want to do research, and like, I just want to work on, pushing the policy boundaries of forest gathering practices, because it's just such a critical area for Native Hawaiian rights. Man, that's a whole nother thread.
Yeah, just the fact that you said pushing policy boundaries is pretty radical.
That's a whole nother thread. But yeah, so obviously land claims, land back, that's still like an active thing here too, with ceded lands and things like that.
So just in general, like the theme being of service, being available to community.
Yeah, I kind of thrive being of service, and that may not be everybody's thing, but that's what fills my cup. I know that by looking at my calendar for the last 3 weeks I've been tracking, and a bunch of it is community work. But it's where people are looking for Native Hawaiian voices and there aren't any. And I'm just like, I just got to do it.
Yeah. And one of the themes, like the reason I feel like we get along so good too, is because we always keep our work practical and relevant, and it's on the ground stuff.
Yeah, it's there's always a need. Like, it's always seeing a problem or addressing a need, and there's no shortage of needs or problems in our communities.
Yeah, I always say that there's no shortage of work, there's no shortage of projects that need to happen. There's lots to do, and we just need people to be able to do those projects.
Oh yeah, man. Really trying to figure out templates on how we can, not set it and forget it, but at least create some structure so things can be implemented other places, and be of service, and be low cost, low maintenance, but still high impact. I think that's really something that's important, especially what I've been talking about the past couple of days is community fatigue. And I don't know if this happens in your community, but there's like cultural impact statements, consultations, and like these different varying level community engagements that people want to hear from Native Hawaiians about rights and access and things like that. And so it's like a small amount of people that go every time. And so some people are passing away that we're usually the point person for that. Other people get fatigued, and it's really easy to get burnout if you don't figure out your balance. Whether you're doing it, whether you're able to do academic work through community, or you're part of the community and, you're starting your academic journey, or you're interested, or you just want to like engage, really understanding like what your energy is and what you're open to giving, because there's really never any end to the need. But we can only so many hours, so many days. And so really thinking about what kind of impact we want to make while we do this work. I try to keep my focus is like, this is where I want to make the impact is on forest gathering practices and getting our communities back on the land, because currently that's a huge issue, especially now with some state parks being closed because of COVID, certain trails being open, another rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, you're doing amazing work in many areas, like the social, political, environmental, political ecology stuff, which I look at and how I try to position myself too. And it's really inspiring for me, because every time we talk story, I always take a lot away, like just for the fact for you to say like pushing policy boundaries and low cost, low maintenance, high impact projects. That stuff's all cool. It's going to inform me in my process. And I assume it's going to inform our listeners. And that's the reason why I wanted you on this podcast.
Yeah, it's been even more important. I can admit that I'm like really stretched thin right now, but everything that I'm doing, I'm not willing to negotiate out of my schedule. So then that means like, where am I going to give? Like, where am I going to give that out? So you need to be like constantly assessing that you're good.
Yeah.
I'm good because it's every day is different and every month is different. And, there's always flex. I think that's something I'm trying to get more raise awareness about,
Hmm.
drinking my water, like actually eating. Because I know when I get really into a project, I just zone in and I'm just like, we're going to do this. And then we do it and then I go eat. So, yeah, self-care is important in this work, man. It's like really critical.
It is, and you're talking about eating. So in this podcast, we always mention food, and we talked a lot of story around food, you and me, and yeah, there's a lot of cool traditional foods there in Hawaii.
Yeah, we're a lot of our traditional foods are like carbohydrates, so taro, root, sweet potatoes, bananas. We're coming into citrus season now, and historically people would preserve our bananas and drying and all of those things. I'm like, what is my like favorite thing though? Yeah, I think I just want a dried banana now.
Yeah. Well, I remember when we were hanging out a few times that you would always have like some sort of snack that was pretty close to a traditional food.
Yeah, we also like growing up. So like I'm Hawaiian, Chinese, Haole, or Caucasian, and so Chinese we eat like these. I probably gave you a lihi moi. Did I give you a lihi moi, the sour thing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the one. Yeah, so we have a lot of sundries in Hawaii. A lot of Chinese snacks that are dried plum, with like lihi moi. It's kind of like the snacks, like little kids' time. So those are always fun. Those are good, like I was gonna say hurricane food, but yeah, totally good hurricane food out here. Um, yeah.
And then just in general too, it was always cool hanging out with you because we were always there on a budget. Like I've never been to Hawaii where I was not on a budget for work or for going there with school related stuff. And you always found a way to like navigate the affordable good food.
Oh yeah, our food in Hawaii is pretty like accessible when
Yeah.
when you come down to it. Um, you want to do grab stuff.
Yeah, being a grad student there, we always just kind of ate what we could get and grab, and it was always like small little meals.
Yeah, a lot of it is really fun. Probably give you guys bentos. And so the real interesting thing about our food is because of that plantation time, a lot of our is influenced like that. So I think people might know about bentos nowadays.
Hmm.
And so obviously that comes from Japanese. So we have a lot of okazuya here, or little Japanese bento place. You can go and pick whatever you want. And so it's kind of like a really big part, even like rice cakes or manapua from Chinatown.
Yeah.
The mixing of the cultures with the food is kind of how we get along. I'll go with how, I think sharing food might be just like a really universal idea. But it's been a really big way of how we communicate our history in Hawaii. Yeah, a lot of our history is in our food, which I imagine is kind of also a theme echoed around the world. Gotta go make some lunch after this.
Yeah. Well, you got access to it, and I don't. I gotta wait till COVID's done and book a flight.
Oh, fun! I know I'm on a different island, man. I live like I don't know, like 10 minutes from the volcano, or where the volcano was the center. So
Cool. Well, you gave us a lot to unpack in this podcast. You gave our listeners who aren't familiar with Indigenous Hawaii and not familiar with the history, a lot of things to think about. We did talk around some things that they probably most likely will have to Google, but I mean it's an informational podcast. It is radical narrative. We're trying to create stories of growth. Stories that inspire people to think outside the box and mobilize themselves and inform themselves. So.
yeah, thanks for having me, Mylan. It's good just to talk story and connect.
Yeah, a lot. We had a lot of good fun experiences together. We didn't mention much of it, like we were actually on Kaho'olawe together and things like that. And yeah.
Oh yeah, man. There's a lot.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for sitting with me. I appreciate your time. And so if our listeners want to find you, where could they find you?
I'm on Twitter at Katie Bam, KTEABAM. And that's kind of my handle across platforms. So Katie Bam is kind of where you find me. And then if people from different communities want to check out what we're doing with our app and want to see if we can collaborate so you guys can kind of do your own jam, I think that would be super amazing. And we're on Instagram at called Kanainai Together, KANAENAE Together, TOGETHER. Yeah, and then our link tree is there, so you can kind of see how we're reaching out to our community, and maybe hopefully that's something that'll be helpful for other communities to connect or reconnect.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. I'll link to that in the show notes so people could find it, and they'll link to your social media.
Cool.
Yeah, you gave us a lot to think about, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, man. I'm excited. I'm just excited to be here and share and talk story. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks. I appreciate it, Katie. We'll talk soon, and yeah, thank you.
Okay, have a good day, Mylin. Aloha.
Aloha. This episode was produced and mixed by Mylin Tatusis, with additional production support by Dara Lucero and Peyton Jackson. If you like what we do, please like, subscribe, and share. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Radical Narrative Podcast. If you wish to contact us, our website